In the 27th year of the Peloponnesian War, a slow poison had drained the greatest of cities. By 404 BC, Athens was in its death throes. A generation of men had vanished, the treasury was empty, and the morale of its citizens was broken. The great city stood on the brink of annihilation, and this decay was not just internal, but visible, physical. This defeat was etched in stone and soul. To the triumphant sound of Spartan flutes, the long walls, once a symbol of the invincible power of Pallas Athena's city, were torn down. The ugly breaches in the walls became a visible scar of humiliation, marking the end of the fratricidal slaughter. The destruction of the walls signified the end of an era, affecting not only military symbols, but the very lifeblood of the city. The economic heart of Athens had stopped. The port of Piraeus, once bustling with trade, fell silent, the quiet broken only by the creak of fishing boats. Democracy was dismantled by the Spartan garrison, which handed absolute power to a board of 30 Athenian oligarchs. The foundations of former prosperity and statehood were destroyed, and this new regime quickly revealed its true, bloody nature. This regime, soon to be known as the 30 Tyrants, plunged the city into a bloody reign of terror. Informants became the norm, executions without trial a routine. The air grew thick with fear and mistrust, as exile and property confiscation became political tools under Sparta's patronage. The city was submerged in an atmosphere of fear that shattered all social bonds. It is in this oppressive atmosphere of universal distrust that we meet our protagonist. Walking the streets of the ruined city was a young man of about 25, an aristocrat from the equestrian order, the Hippaeus. His name was Xenophon, son of Gryllus. His age and noble birth made his position in the dying city particularly difficult and bleak. What opportunities could a 25-year-old ambitious aristocrat have in a ruined city? His background made him suspect to the new rulers, and the ideals he was raised on had been devalued. He saw veterans begging for alms in the agora and understood. His future had been erased by the war. He didn't just contemplate this, he faced its horrifying reality every day. Reality became an unbearable prison for him. He heard of executions based on accusations and felt the glory of Athens, the greatness of Marathon and Salamis, turned to dust. His body was built for battle, his mind for great ideas, but the world he was prepared for had been utterly destroyed. Not only his inner world had collapsed, but all his concrete life plans as well. The future destined for him, a career as a politician and a commander, had vanished with the smoke of burned Athenian ships. And while Xenophon was experiencing this personal collapse, far to the east, in the vast expanses of the mighty Persian Empire, a new conflict was brewing. A distant storm was rising on the horizon, a yet unseen force destined to change his fate. This distant Persian conflict was fated to draw in thousands of desperate Greek mercenaries seeking to apply their skills, like a maelstrom. Xenophon would be among them, but something far greater than mere mercenary service awaited him. He was destined to walk an incredible path. A journey into the heart of an enemy empire, betrayal, and a desperate march of thousands of miles awaited him. He would transform from an aristocrat philosopher into a leader who saved 10,000 lives, and his name would be immortalized not by the sword, but by the pen. But for now, in the fallen city, he was just a confused young man, listening to the words of his teacher, Socrates, and wondering where to find his path. The answer would come from an unexpected source. The answer arrived in a letter from an old friend in Asia. To understand its significance, we must look at the hero's origins. Xenophon was born around 430 BC into one of Athens' wealthiest families. His father, Gryllus belonged to an ancient lineage, which automatically placed the young man in the highest class of horsemen. This high status defined his entire way of life and upbringing. Belonging to the equestrian order was not just a title, but a whole culture. From childhood, Xenophon was trained in horsemanship, weaponry, and gymnastics, preparing him for the role of a defender of the city. His future seemed secure, clear, and brilliant. Civic virtues and military feats in the service of the greatest city in Hellas. His path was predetermined from birth. His childhood coincided with the golden age of Pericles, the era of Athens' greatest flourishing, which shaped his ideals. He grew up on stories of victories over the Persians, watched the Parthenon being built, and absorbed the intellectual spirit of the agora. Athenian democracy was at its peak, the treasury full. He was raised in an age of seemingly unshakable greatness. However, this brilliant picture was deceptive. The idyllic picture was merely a facade. In 431 BC, when Xenophon was still a child, the clouds gathered and the Peloponnesian War began. This conflict, a tragedy for the entire Greek world, pitted Athens and its maritime empire against Sparta and its land-based league. The time of peace was over, and this war was unlike any before. This was not a short, seasonal campaign, but a total war of attrition that lasted for nearly 3 decades. Xenophon grew up to the news from the fronts, tales of sieges, political intrigues, and Spartan armies ravaging the fields of Attica. The war became the grim backdrop to his entire youth, but soon, another, more terrible catastrophe was added to the woes of war. The most devastating blow was the Plague of Athens in 429 BC, which wiped out up to a third of the city's population. Among the dead was the great Pericles. The death of the wise statesman opened the way for irresponsible demagogues and adventurers, whose decisions became increasingly radical. The death of Pericles marked the beginning of an irreversible political decline. Xenophon, now a young man, witnessed democracy degenerating into mob rule, an ochlocracy. Decisions were made based on emotion rather than reason. Upon reaching adulthood, he, as a horseman, took part in the final campaigns of the war, and this personal experience only confirmed his fears about the crisis of democracy. Service in the elite cavalry was prestigious and dangerous. The horsemen patrolled the borders of Attica, conducted reconnaissance, and covered the hoplites. Here, Xenophon gained his first combat experience, learned to control a horse in battle, assess terrain, and make quick decisions. He learned firsthand the true price of a human life, but this experience also filled him with deep disappointment. The years of war hardened him, but also brought bitterness. He saw the incompetence of generals and the political cowardice, watching the best warriors die due to the mistakes of the People's Assembly. The culmination of this tragedy was the catastrophic Sicilian expedition of 415–419 BC, an adventure that had irreversible consequences for Athens. A huge Athenian fleet and army were completely annihilated in Sicily. This venture, aimed at conquering a distant island, consumed colossal resources, and the city never recovered from the blow. For Xenophon and his circle, this was the final proof that democracy was leading the city to ruin. The aristocratic youth began to seek an alternative. The disillusioned aristocratic youth increasingly leaned towards a Spartan-style oligarchy, dreaming of the rule of the best. In these conditions, defeat in the war became a logical and terrible outcome. In 404 BC, Sparta, funded by Persian gold, crushed the Athenian fleet at Aegospotami, blockaded the city, and made surrender inevitable. Famine forced Athens to capitulate, and the pro-Spartan oligarchic junta of the 30 Tyrants seized power. It was led by Critias, a former student of Socrates. Their regime, based on violence, sought to rebuild the state on the Spartan model, destroying democracy and physically eliminating all opponents. A brutal dictatorship was established. For moderate aristocrats like Xenophon, this was a time of agonizing choices. He did not accept radical democracy, but the terror of the tyrants was equally repugnant to him. Caught between a rock and a hard place, he could not align with either side, while many of his friends either supported the tyrants or became their victims. Xenophon tried to stay aloof, but in an atmosphere where the old values, honor, loyalty to the city, justice, were trampled, this was nearly impossible. The Athens of his youth had become a place of fear and despair. His world was destroyed to its foundations. And in this new world, he was completely out of place. Xenophon's military skills were no longer needed in a humiliated city, forbidden to have a large army. His aristocratic background made him suspicious to all political forces, both democrats and tyrants. This feeling of complete hopelessness, the collapse of all life's guideposts, forced him to look beyond Attica in search of a place where a skilled warrior and educated Hellene could find purpose. However, despite the political chaos, Athens remained a center of intellectual life. Parallel to the city's decline, its spiritual life continued to thrive, centered around the figure of the philosopher Socrates. He wrote no books, had no formal school, and took no money for his teaching. His method was entirely different. Socrates simply walked around the city, through the streets, markets, and gymnasiums, and struck up conversations with anyone. Among those captivated by his personality was the young Xenophon. This meeting became a defining event for the young man, shaping his moral compass and philosophical views for the rest of his life. Socrates became his greatest teacher. Imagine the Athenian agora, the pulsating heart of the city, where ideas clashed and deals were made. Amid this noise and bustle appeared Socrates, a short, stocky, unattractive man with bulging eyes, resembling a Silenus from a satyr play. His plain appearance stood in sharp contrast to his activities. His method was to use simple questions to lead self-assured individuals to the realization of their own ignorance. He would stop a politician and ask, "What is justice?" The man would answer confidently, but under a barrage of Socratic questions, his confidence would melt away, and in the end, he would be forced to admit he did not know the answer. His method exposed false wisdom. For the golden youth, accustomed to the sophists, paid teachers of wisdom who taught the art of argument for success and claimed that truth was relative, Socrates' method was a revelation. Socrates, however, began by admitting his own ignorance. "I know only that I know nothing." His goal was not to win an argument, but a joint search for truth, which he called mutix, aiding in the birth of knowledge. Xenophon, as a man of a practical mind, unlike Plato, was less interested in metaphysical abstractions. He was concerned with questions of applied ethics, how to live a worthy life, how to become a good citizen, friend, and commander. It was in his conversations with Socrates that he found answers. Socrates taught that virtue, or arete, is knowledge. No one does evil willingly, but only out of ignorance. To be brave, one must know what is truly worth fearing. To be just, one must know what justice is. Knowledge, in his view, was the foundation of all virtue. The key idea that Xenophon took from this teaching was enkrateia, self-control. A true leader is one who has learned to master himself. A person unable to control their anger, greed, or fear cannot and has no right to govern others. master yourself to master others. This idea of self-control as the basis of leadership became a leitmotif in all of Xenophon's works, from the Cyropaedia, a treatise on the ideal ruler, to the Anabasis, where he, as the leader of 10,000 troops, applied his teacher's lessons in practice. Philosophy became the foundation of his practice and his art. His association with Socrates took place against the backdrop of a deep crisis. Xenophon saw how democracy brought ignorant demagogues to power, and Socrates' merciless criticism of this system resonated deeply with him. These ideas were popular among the disillusioned aristocratic youth, but such criticism was very dangerous. In the eyes of many Athenians, Socrates' criticism looked like subversion. He was considered a corrupter of youth, accused of not honoring the city's gods and introducing new ones. Socrates was becoming an enemy of the system, and his reputation was further tarnished by his connections to odious political figures. His association with figures like Alcibiades and the tyrant Critias cast a shadow on Socrates, although he himself never approved of their actions. After the restoration of democracy in 403 BC, the Athenians sought scapegoats for their misfortunes, and the wrath of the mob turned on the philosopher. His impeccable reputation was compromised. In 399 BC, while Xenophon was far away in Asia, Socrates was charged and sentenced to death. The news of the execution was a terrible blow to his student, and the final confirmation of his worst fears about Athenian democracy. The execution of his teacher became for him a point of no return. This event largely predetermined his future, causing many years of exile and service to Athens' enemies, the Spartans. To defend his teacher's memory from slander, he wrote several Socratic works: Memorabilia, Apology, Symposium, and Economicus. In these works, Xenophon created an image of Socrates not as an abstract metaphysician, as he appears in Plato, but as a wise and practical mentor. He sought to prove that his teacher did not corrupt, but rather instilled piety, moderation, and civic virtue in the youth, thereby benefiting the city. It was these lessons that became the backbone that allowed him to withstand all trials. And while Athens was trying to recover from war and tyranny, far to the east, in the gigantic Persian Achaemenid Empire, a dynastic storm was brewing, one that would soon affect the Greek world. The catalyst for this storm was the death of the ruling king. In 404 BC, the Persian king Darius II died, triggering a struggle for the throne. His eldest son Arsaces ascended as Artaxerxes II, but he had a younger brother, Cyrus, the favorite of the queen mother Parysatis, who also laid claim to power. An irreconcilable struggle for the Persian throne began. The two brothers were complete opposites. Artaxerxes was cautious and indecisive, preferring palace intrigue. Cyrus, on the other hand, was young, energetic, ambitious, and charismatic. During his father's lifetime, he had been appointed satrap of Lydia, Phrygia, and Cappadocia, and commander-in-chief in Asia Minor. Cyrus was a born leader. As a satrap, Cyrus proved to be a talented administrator and commander. Unlike other Persian nobles, he was direct, kept his word, and generously rewarded loyal servants. He developed particularly close relationships with the Greeks. During the Peloponnesian War, he backed Sparta, supplying it with money, and thus earned their trust. Having become closely acquainted with Greek warriors, especially the Spartans, Cyrus highly valued their combat skills. He saw the discipline and invincibility of the hoplite phalanx and realized that this was the force he needed to carry out his secret plan, to seize the Persian throne. The Greeks were the key to his plan. Citing the formal pretext that he was born after his father had become king, Cyrus began to secretly prepare a rebellion. However, his rival, the satrap Tissaphernes, informed the new king. Cyrus was arrested and nearly executed. Only the desperate pleas of his mother Parysatis saved his life. His first attempt at rebellion failed, but he was not only released, but also reinstated in his satrapy. This was a fatal mistake by Artaxerxes. Insulted and humiliated, Cyrus returned to his capital, Sardis, with even greater determination to overthrow his brother. The pardon had only made him more dangerous, but now he decided to act much more cunningly. He found a plausible excuse to gather a new, more powerful army. Under the pretext of fighting the rebellious Pisidian highlanders and border disputes with Tissaphernes, Cyrus began to secretly assemble an army. The core of this army was to be Greek mercenaries, or misthophoroi. At that time, Greece was full of warriors ready for such service. After the Peloponnesian War, thousands of professional soldiers, with no work and no home, roamed throughout Hellas. These battle-hardened and resilient men knew only how to fight. For them, Cyrus, with his immense wealth and reputation as a friend of the Hellenes, was the ideal employer. Recruitment was conducted through trusted agents. One of the recruiters was Proxenus of Boeotia, an old friend of Xenophon. He wrote him a letter, which, without revealing the true purpose of the campaign, tempted him with brilliant opportunities. Proxenus described Cyrus as generous patron, promising Xenophon wealth and a friendship with the prince himself, which he claimed was more valuable than one's own country. Xenophon had received a fateful offer. For Xenophon, who faced only obscurity and danger in Athens, this offer sounded like an answer to all his prayers. The idea of venturing to Asia, testing himself, and gaining glory was incredibly alluring. However, being a cautious man, he did not accept the offer immediately, but went to Socrates for advice. Socrates, understanding the risks of serving the Persians, advised Xenophon to consult the oracle of Apollo at Delphi. But Xenophon, already seized by a thirst for adventure, was cunning. He asked not, "Should I go?" but "To which gods should I pray for a successful journey?" Having received an answer, he returned to Socrates, who reproached him but told him to obey the gods' will. In the spring of 401 BC, Xenophon set out. He journeyed to Sardis not as a hired soldier, but as a civilian observer, a guest of his friend Proxenus. He did not yet know that this path would lead him thousands of miles deep into a hostile land, that he would become a participant in a grand military drama, and that his journey home would immortalize his name and the names of his 10,000 comrades. A great adventure was beginning. In the spring of 401 BC, Sardis, the capital of Lydia, was buzzing with unusual activity. Detachments of mercenaries flocked here from all over the Greek world: Spartans, Arcadians, Achaeans, Boeotians. These were men for whom war had become a profession, the flower of Hellenic soldiery. A powerful army of professionals was assembling. The official announcement was that the army was gathering for a campaign against the Pisidian highlanders. This objective seemed plausible and raised no suspicion. Each soldier was promised a generous wage, 1 gold daric a month, which was significantly higher than the usual pay. The cover story was very convincing. Arriving in Sardis, Xenophon was struck by the scale of the operation. The army numbered about 13,000 Greek hoplites and peltasts, as well as nearly 100,000 barbarian troops. The Greek contingent was commanded by experienced generals, among whom the Spartan Clearchus, a stern and authoritative veteran, stood out. Among the commanders were Xenophon's friend, Proxenus the Boeotian, and the avaricious Thessalian, Menon. Xenophon himself held no command position, but was merely an observer, traveling in Proxenus's retinue. Finally, the vast army set out, and it was a mesmerizing sight. The movement of this enormous mass of people was impressive. The light infantry marched at the front, followed by the unbreakable wall of shields and spears of the Greek phalanx. In the center rode Cyrus himself with his guard. At first, the march led through familiar lands of Asia Minor, and the soldiers faced no difficulties. But as they advanced eastward, doubts began to arise among the Greeks. When the army passed Pisidia, but Cyrus did not turn towards the highlanders, and instead continued leading the troops southeast, a murmur of discontent began to grow among the soldiers. They realized they were not being led against wild tribes. The scale of the enterprise pointed to a much more serious objective. Everyone understood they were being led against the great king, towards Babylon. The realization of the true goal of the campaign led to an outright mutiny in the Cilician city of Tarsus. The Greeks flatly refused to go any further, stating that they had not been hired to fight against the mighty Persian monarch and considered it suicide. The situation became critical, and Cyrus's entire plan was in jeopardy. In this critical situation, Cyrus's talent as a leader and psychologist shone through. He did not resort to threats, but gathered the Greeks and delivered a speech full of feigned despair. When that didn't work, he shut himself in his tent, while his agents spread rumors about the dangers of the journey back. Cyrus used clever psychological pressure. The Spartan Clearchus, likely in league with Cyrus, played along in this game. He pretended to persuade the prince, but, in reality, convinced the Greeks to stay. The decisive argument, however, was Cyrus's promise to increase their pay by 1.5 times. This argument, reinforced by fear, proved decisive, and the Greeks, heavy-hearted, agreed to march on. The army crossed the Cilician gates and entered the plains of northern Syria. Here, in the city of Myrandris, another incident occurred. 2 Greek generals, Xenias and Passion, fearing the consequences, deserted with their troops on ships. Everyone expected Cyrus to be furious, but he once again acted wisely. Everyone expected Cyrus's wrath, but he again acted as a wise leader. He gathered the soldiers and announced that he would not pursue the deserters. His magnanimous speech about how those who served him voluntarily meant more to him completely won the hearts of the Greeks. They understood they were serving a man of honor. The climax of the march was the crossing of the Euphrates. At the city of Thapsacus on the Euphrates River, Cyrus finally officially announced to the soldiers that he was marching on Babylon to overthrow his brother. He promised every Greek, in addition to their pay, a huge reward in case of victory. Now that the army had come so far, there was no point in hiding the true purpose of the campaign. Each soldier was promised not only 5 minas of silver, but also a golden wreath, a symbol of victory. Enthusiasm, fueled by promises and personal loyalty to Cyrus, swept through the army. Now they were not just mercenaries, but comrades in a great enterprise. Having crossed the river, they entered Mesopotamia. The way back was cut off. After the crossing, the army moved south along the left bank of the Euphrates. The soldiers were exhausted by the scorching sun and the lack of water and food on the parched Mesopotamian plain. Scouts reported the gathering of a huge enemy army, but it was nowhere to be seen. This uncertainty was unnerving. Finally, in early September of 401 BC, the armies met near a place called Kunasa. The sight was terrifying. The king's army, according to various estimates, numbered from 400,000 to 1,000,000 soldiers. The enemy had an overwhelming numerical superiority. The scythed chariots caused particular alarm among the Greeks. These heavy war wagons, with long, sharp scythes attached to the wheel axles, were designed to charge into the infantry ranks and cut them down, sowing panic and death. The enemy possessed a fearsome weapon. Cyrus arrayed his army for battle. On the right flank, anchored to the bank of the Euphrates, he placed the Greeks under the command of Clearchus. This was his main strike force. Cyrus himself, with a guard of 600 horsemen, took his position in the center. The left flank consisted of his Asian subjects under the command of the satrap Ariaeus. Before the battle began, Cyrus, accompanied by Xenophon, rode along the Greek ranks. He was without a helmet, so that the soldiers could see his face, and he spoke encouraging words about freedom and valor. He gave Clearchus a clear order to attack the center of the Persian army, where the king was located, believing this was the key to victory. However, the experienced but overly cautious Clearchus disobeyed the order. Fearing to detach his flank from the river and be surrounded, he led the Greeks not towards the center, but straight ahead, against the opposing wing of the Persian army. The battle began. The Greeks advanced on the enemy in complete silence. When the distance closed, they let out a deafening war cry, struck their spears against their shields, and broke into a run. This coordinated, fearsome charge had a stunning effect on the Persians. The barbarians could not withstand it. The barbarians, unable to bear the sight of the charging phalanx, faltered and fled in a panic, without even engaging in combat. The scythed chariots proved ineffective. The hoplites simply parted their ranks, letting them pass and striking down the drivers. The right flank of the king's army was crushed and scattered. The Greeks, carried away by the pursuit, advanced far ahead. While the Greeks were pursuing the fleeing enemy, believing the battle won, Cyrus in the center spotted his brother Artaxerxes in the distance, surrounded by his guard. Seeing the Persian center outflanking his left wing, he, consumed by rage, made a fatal decision. Consumed by the desire to decide the battle's outcome personally, he, with a small detachment of bodyguards, launched a desperate charge directly at the king. His assault was so swift that he broke through the ranks of the guards and, in single combat, managed to wound his brother in the chest with a javelin. Cyrus had almost reached his goal. But at that moment, luck abandoned him. One of the king's soldiers threw a javelin and hit Cyrus just below the eye. The rebel prince fell from his horse. A fierce fight erupted around his body, in which all his loyal bodyguards perished to the last man. Cyrus was killed at the decisive moment. The rebellion was over. The Greeks, returning from their pursuit, were stunned to learn that while they had brilliantly won their battle, they had lost the entire war. Their employer was dead, and they were alone, without command or purpose, in the heart of a hostile empire. A tactical victory had turned into a strategic catastrophe. The sunset over the field of Cunaxa symbolized the end of the life and ambitions of Cyrus the Younger. But for Xenophon and his 10,000 comrades, this was only the beginning of their own epic, a desperate march for survival that would go down in history as the Anabasis. The end of one story was the beginning of another. The death of Cyrus plunged the Greeks into a state of shock and confusion. They had won a tactical victory, but found themselves in a strategic dead end. The Asian part of the army under Ariaeus quickly retreated, leaving them completely alone against the full might of the Persian Empire. The Greeks did not consider themselves defeated, as they had not retreated from the battlefield. However, the next day it became clear how desperate their situation was. King Artaxerxes sent envoys with a humiliating ultimatum, a demand to lay down their arms. Despite the complexity of the situation, the Greeks responded with a pride befitting free Hellenes. Clearchus declared on their behalf that victors do not surrender their weapons. They were prepared either to serve the king on honorable terms or to fight their way home. complex and dangerous negotiations began. The chief negotiator for the Persians was the cunning satrap Tissaphernes, the personal enemy of the late Cyrus. Feigning friendship, he arrived at the Greek camp. Praising their valor, he promised that he had convinced the king to grant them safe passage home, provisions, and reliable guides. The Greek generals, especially Clearchus, treated these proposals with great suspicion. They were well aware of Persian treachery, but there was no other way out. After long debates, they decided to accept Tissaphernes' offer, concluded a truce, and began marching north. For several weeks, the Greek army, escorted by Tissaphernes' forces, marched north. The atmosphere was extremely tense. The Persians and Greeks kept their distance, and skirmishes constantly erupted. Seeing the Persians burning villages in their path, Clearchus decided to take a risky step and demand a personal meeting with Tissaphernes. Tissaphernes gladly agreed to the meeting. He was the epitome of courtesy. After convincing Clearchus that all misunderstandings were the work of slanderers in both armies, he proposed that all the Greek commanders, the generals and captains, should come to his camp for a joint council, where they would together punish the guilty. Despite warnings from many officers, the stubborn and authoritarian Clearchus believed him, or pretended to. He persuaded the others to follow him. 5 generals, including Clearchus himself and Xenophon's friend Proxenus, and 20 captains set off for the Persian camp. The Greek command was walking straight into a trap. What happened next was one of the most perfidious acts in history. As soon as the commanders entered Tissaphernes' tent, they were ambushed by guards. The 5 generals were seized and sent to the king, where they were beheaded after being tortured. The 20 captains and their escorts were slaughtered on the spot. The entire command was annihilated. The Greeks in their camp anxiously awaited the return of their commanders. Instead, they saw a Persian horseman galloping at full speed. He was a Greek turncoat who brought the terrible truth. The army was leaderless, its entire high command treacherously wiped out. That evening, complete despair descended upon the Greek camp. It seemed to be the end. They were deep in enemy territory, surrounded, without leaders, and without any hope. No one lit fires. No one prepared dinner. The soldiers simply lay on the ground, mourning their fate and thinking of the families they were never destined to see again. Faith in oaths and gods was shattered. It was the darkest night of their march. It seemed the morning would never come. But it was in this moment of despair that Xenophon, who had until then remained in the shadows, was destined to step onto the stage of history. Xenophon, like everyone else, could not sleep for a long time, grieving the death of his friend Proxenus and realizing the hopelessness of their situation. Drifting off, he had a dream. A thunderstorm. Lightning strikes his father's house, and everything around is illuminated by a bright light. Waking up, he began to ponder the meaning of this divine sign. He reasoned. On one hand, the dream could foretell death, but on the other, the light could be a sign of salvation. And then a thought struck him. Why was he just lying here, waiting? The night was passing, and at dawn, the enemy would appear. He thought of a shameful death and torture. Why were they waiting for someone else to lead, instead of acting themselves? This thought became a turning point for him. Realizing that passive waiting was tantamount to death, Xenophon rose immediately. He sought out the captains from his fallen friend, Proxenus' contingent, gathered them, and addressed them with a fiery speech to restore their will to fight. He did not hide the dangers, but appealed to their courage and dignity. He reminded them that they were Hellenes, descendants of heroes, and could not surrender to the enemy. Their only salvation lay in their own valor and discipline. He urged them to immediately elect new commanders and prepare for battle. Xenophon's energy and confidence had an effect on the dispirited officers. They agreed and asked him to lead them. They then dispersed throughout the camp to gather all the surviving commanders. By midnight, about 100 men had assembled. The Spartan Chrysosopus opened the meeting. After him, Xenophon took the floor. This was perhaps the most important speech of his life. Standing before the commanders in the dim light of torches, he reframed their tragic situation not as a tragedy, but as a challenge and an opportunity to show the greatest valor, changing their perspective. He instilled confidence in them, pointing to their moral and military superiority. The Greeks were better armed, more disciplined, and unlike the Persians, were fighting for their lives, not for a master. He proposed a concrete plan that gave rational grounds for hope. The plan had 3 points. First, to immediately elect new commanders to replace the slain ones. Second, to burn everything superfluous, tents and wagons, to increase mobility. And third, to develop a new marching tactic, to move in a hollow square formation to repel attacks from any direction. Xenophon's speech made a tremendous impression. It was passionate, logical, and most importantly, it offered hope and a concrete plan of action. The soldiers, who had been in complete prostration just moments before, felt a surge of strength and unanimously approved all his proposals. Elections were held immediately. The Spartan Chrysosopus was elected general in place of the slain Clearchus, and Xenophon was chosen to replace his friend, Proxenus. Thus, in a single night, the Athenian philosopher-observer transformed into one of the main leaders of the 10,000-strong army. In Xenophon, the dormant talent of a commander, organizer, and orator awakened. He did not have the combat experience of the Spartans, but he possessed a flexible mind and a capacity for unconventional solutions. And most importantly, thanks to the lessons of Socrates, he had a deep understanding of human psychology and knew how to inspire courage in people. His strength lay in his intellect and charisma. That night, in the very heart of the Persian Empire, the surrounded army found a new leader. He would lead them through unimaginable trials to the north, towards a distant and singular goal, the saving sea. A new, most desperate stage of the march had begun. With the first rays of dawn, the Greek camp was transformed. Instead of despondency, there was bustling activity. Soldiers burned everything superfluous, and huge bonfires became a symbol of their resolve. The army formed up in battle order, a vast hollow square, a living bastion bristling with spears in all directions. As soon as they set out, they were immediately attacked. Persian cavalry and archers immediately attacked the rearguard, showering the Greeks with arrows and javelins from a safe distance. The Greeks suffered losses but could do nothing, as they had almost no archers or cavalry. On the very first day, this tactic revealed their serious vulnerability. That night, Xenophon once again demonstrated his tactical ingenuity. He proposed creating special units of Rhodian slingers, whose stones flew farther than Persian arrows, and forming a small cavalry detachment of 50 horsemen from the available horses. These measures immediately paid off. The next day, the Persians were met with a hail of stones and a surprise attack from the Greek cavalry. Having suffered losses, the Persians were forced to keep their distance. The army was able to continue its journey north, towards the mountains of the Carducci, but a new trial soon awaited them. The Greeks' path was blocked by mountains inhabited by the fierce and independent Carducci people, who did not submit even to the Persian king. The 7-day crossing of their lands turned into a nightmare and cost the Greeks more losses than all the battles with the Persian army. The new enemy proved even more dangerous. There were no roads, only narrow and steep paths. The Carducci, masters of guerrilla warfare, constantly set up ambushes, rolled rocks down on the Greeks from the heights, and showered them with arrows. The Greeks had to fight for every pass, waging an exhausting mountain war in which Xenophon was at the heart of the action. Xenophon, commanding the rearguard, was constantly in the thick of the fighting, organizing the defense and encouraging the soldiers. Here, he displayed not only personal bravery, but also a talent for tactical ruses, outflanking enemy positions and taking them by surprise. Finally, bleeding, the Greeks broke through into Armenia, where a new enemy awaited them. In Armenia, the new enemy was the harsh winter. Deep snow lay on the high plateau, and the cold was biting. The soldiers, dressed in light Greek clothing, suffered terribly from the cold, many without shoes. Widespread frostbite and snow blindness began. Nature became their main adversary. Hunger was added to the cold, as the locals hid all their supplies. Often, the Greeks had to spend the night directly in the snow. Many collapsed from exhaustion and froze to death. The army's morale was again at a breaking point. Stragglers refused to go on, preferring death to the torment. At this critical moment, Xenophon had to resort to extreme measures. Understanding that any stop was equivalent to death, he ordered his bodyguards to forcibly lift the exhausted and make them move. The army stubbornly continued its agonizing journey north. In those days, Xenophon was the soul of the army. He was the soul of the army, sharing all hardships with the soldiers. He walked on foot, helped carry the weapons of those lagging behind, and found words of encouragement for the disheartened. His personal example prevented the army from breaking. That they endured this torturous march seemed a miracle, possible only thanks to iron discipline in his leadership. After the grueling march, they reached the land of the Taochi, where they fought for food. Then they passed through the lands of the Chalybes, who met them fiercely. Finally, they reached the large and wealthy city of Gymnias, whose ruler, to their surprise, greeted them friendly and provided them with a guide. This guide, needing the strength of the Greeks for his own war, swore that within 5 days he would lead them to a place from which they would see the sea. This promise, a close and clear goal, breathed new life into the exhausted warriors. For the Greeks, the sea was synonymous with home and salvation. For the Greeks, a nation of seafarers, the sea was everything. Home, freedom, salvation. It was the very goal that had led them through all their inhuman suffering. The guide led the army, and on the 5th day, they climbed a high mountain called Tessaphernes. The soldiers of the vanguard were the first to reach the summit. Suddenly, from the rearguard below, they heard a loud, multi-voiced shout from the summit. Xenophon and the other commanders initially thought the vanguard was under attack and rushed to help. As they got closer, the shouts grew louder, but there was no fear or anger in them. At the summit, Xenophon witnessed an unforgettable scene. Stern, battle-hardened veterans were weeping, embracing, falling to their knees. They all pointed to the north, where a distant blue strip glistened on the horizon, and shouted in ecstasy a single word, "Thalata! Thalata!" which meant, "The sea, the sea." They had reached their great goal. In that cry was everything: relief after inhuman suffering, the joy of salvation, and the hope of return. Men who had walked thousands of miles, lost comrades, died of hunger and cold, saw living proof that all their torment was not in vain. They had made it. As a sign of gratitude to the gods, the soldiers built a huge mound of stones on the summit. Descending, they passed through the friendly lands of the Macrones, and then fought their way through the lands of Colchis, the legendary country where, according to myths, the Argonauts sailed for the Golden Fleece. After defeating the Colchians, who had hostilely blocked their path, the inspired Greeks finally reached the coast of the Black Sea, near the Greek colony city of Trapezus. They had reached civilization, their own kinsmen. Their arrival in Trapezus was a true celebration for them. The inhabitants of Trapezus warmly welcomed the 10,000 kinsmen, providing them with a market and helping the wounded. After staying in the city for about a month, the Greeks celebrated their salvation. They held grand gymnastic and equestrian games and offered abundant sacrifices to the gods, Zeus the savior and Heracles the leader. It seemed the main difficulties were behind them. However, the army had neither money nor ships to transport 10,000 men home. The question of what to do next arose with full force, causing serious disputes and unrest in the army. The discipline that had saved them began to falter. The cry of the sea was a cry of hope, but the path from that hope to its realization proved to be no less difficult and dangerous than the entire preceding march. The trials for the 10,000 were not yet over. Having reached the coast, the army ceased to be a single organism and turned into a crowd of armed men. The main problem was the lack of ships. The Spartan admiral Anabasis, to whom they appealed for help, deceived them, wanting only to get the troublesome army away from the Greek colonies as quickly as possible. The army slowly moved west along the southern coast of the Black Sea. This journey was marked by constant conflicts not only with local tribes, but also with the Greek colonies, which looked with fear upon such a large and increasingly unruly force. Due to the lack of pay, the exhausted soldiers increasingly resorted to looting. The army split into parts several times, leading to tragic losses. Xenophon and other commanders had to make incredible efforts to maintain unity. The army was on the verge of complete collapse. Finally, the remnants of the army reached Thrace, on the European coast. Here they received an unexpected offer. The local Thracian king, Cyrus II, offered the Greeks to enter his service to help him reclaim his lost domains. The exhausted and impoverished soldiers gladly accepted. Xenophon, though he dreamed of returning home, stayed with the army out of a sense of responsibility. The service was successful. In 2 winter months, the Greeks defeated the king's enemies. However, Cyrus proved treacherous and unwilling to pay the promised wages. They were deceived again. It was at this moment that a new, much more serious opportunity appeared on the horizon. Sparta, having become the hegemon of Greece, had started a war with Persia. It needed experienced warriors, and the army of the 10,000, battle-hardened and familiar with Persian methods of warfare, was an invaluable asset. Spartan emissaries arrived in Thrace and offered the Greeks to join their army. In the spring of 399 BC, Xenophon handed over command of the remaining 6,000 soldiers to a Spartan commander. The great march of the 10,000, which had lasted for almost 2 years, was officially over. Xenophon himself also entered the service of the Spartans. He soon became a close friend and advisor to the outstanding Spartan king and general, Agesilaus, in whom he found the embodiment of all the qualities he valued most: courage, moderation, and wisdom. He had found his ideal leader. However, this service had fatal consequences for Xenophon. A new war, the Corinthian War, broke out in Greece, in which Sparta's former allies, including Xenophon's native Athens, united against it. In 394 BC, Agesilaus was recalled from Asia. In the decisive Battle of Coronea, the Spartan army clashed with the coalition army, and Xenophon, an Athenian citizen, fought in the Spartan ranks against his own countrymen. The Athenians regarded this act as treason. The People's Assembly of Athens sentenced him in absentia to exile and confiscation of all his property. Thus, the man who dreamed of returning to his homeland as a hero was cut off from it. Ironically, the campaign that was supposed to bring him glory and wealth for a life in his native city led to perpetual exile. But perhaps it was this event that gave world literature one of its greatest authors. In gratitude for his loyal service, the Spartans gave Xenophon an estate in Sicily, near Olympia. Deprived of his homeland, he found the time and peace to reflect on his incredible experience. Here, in Sicily, began the longest and perhaps happiest period of Xenophon's life, lasting about 20 years. Far from political storms, he was able to realize the dream of many aristocrats, to live the life of a landowner in complete harmony with nature. With his own funds, he built a small but elegant temple on the estate, an exact copy of the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus. Every year, he held a great festival in honor of the goddess of the hunt, treating all the local inhabitants to dishes from the hunt and wine from his vineyards. In Sicily, he led the life he would later idealize in his treatise, Economicus. He engaged in agriculture and hunting, married, and had 2 sons, Grillus and Diodorus, whom he raised in the best traditions of the Hellenic aristocracy. But his main occupation became literary work. Xenophon's main occupation during these years was to make sense of his experience. In the quiet of his estate, he took up the pen to justify his actions, defend the memory of his teacher Socrates, glorify heroes, and pass on his invaluable experience to posterity. The main work of his life was undoubtedly the Anabasis, the March Up Country. It is a unique blend of genres, a military memoir, an invaluable geographical and ethnographic source, and a deep study of the psychology of the soldier and the crowd. Above all, it is an apologia for Xenophon himself and a hymn to Greek valor. Modestly writing the book in the third person, he nevertheless created a convincing image of the ideal leader, wise, brave, and caring. Here, in Sicily, he also wrote his Socratic works to defend his teacher from unjust accusations. Inspired by the personality of his friend, King Agesilaus, he wrote a panegyric to him. Reflecting on the ideal ruler, he created the Cyropaedia, the Education of Cyrus, the first political and pedagogical novel in history, in which he paints a portrait of the ideal monarch through the example of the founder of the Persian Empire. In addition, he penned the historical work Hellenica, which continues Thucydides' narrative, as well as a number of small treatises on practical topics, on horsemanship, the cavalry commander, on hunting, and ways and means. He was a surprisingly versatile writer. This peaceful period ended in 371 BC. After the crushing defeat of the Spartans by the Thebans at the Battle of Leuctra, Elis broke away from Sparta. Xenophon, as a friend of the Spartans, had to leave his estate. He moved to Corinth. Around the same time, Athens annulled the decree of his exile. He could have returned to his homeland, but it seems he never did, living out the rest of his days in Corinth. His sons, raised in the Spartan tradition, fought in the ranks of the Athenian cavalry. In the Battle of Mantinea in 362 BC, his eldest son Grillus was killed. He outlived his son. There is a legend about how he received this news. When he was told of his son's death, he only removed his wreath and asked if he had died bravely. Hearing yes, he placed the wreath back on his head, showing stoic self-control. Xenophon died around 354 BC, having lived a long, incredibly eventful life as an Athenian horseman, a student of Socrates, a soldier of fortune, a leader, a king's friend, an exile, and a writer. Xenophon's story is a mirror of an entire era. It reflects the deep crisis of the Greek polis, the end of Athens' golden age, and the dramatic clash between the Hellenic world and the Persian Empire. He was a product of his time and a personality who managed to overcome it. The uniqueness of Xenophon lies in the fact that in his fate, two great forces of ancient life, action, praxis, and thought, logos, were equally combined and successful. He was a true man of both deed and word. As a man of action, he lived a life that could fill several adventure novels. He was a warrior and a leader who, in a moment of complete despair, managed to take responsibility for 10,000 lives and save them, leading them through unimaginable trials. His Anabasis became not just a story, but a practical textbook on military tactics, logistics, and the psychology of leadership. This book was carefully studied by many great commanders, including Alexander the Great, who, setting out for the East, undoubtedly kept Xenophon's experience in mind. The March of the 10,000 clearly demonstrated a simple truth to the entire Greek world. The Persian Empire, despite its size, was a colossus with feet of clay. A small but disciplined detachment of Greeks could pass through it like a knife through butter. This lesson predetermined the success of the future conquest of Asia. However, the legacy of Xenophon, the writer, proved to be even more enduring. He did not possess the philosophical depth of Plato, but his strength lay elsewhere, in clarity, practicality, and humanism. His writings gave us an alternative, more down-to-earth image of Socrates, showing him as a teacher of practical wisdom. His Cyropedia became the progenitor of a whole genre of mirrors for princes and influenced political thought from antiquity to the Enlightenment. And his minor treatises are an invaluable source of knowledge about the daily life, values, and knowledge of an ancient aristocrat. Assessments of his personality throughout history have varied. He was reproached for narcissism, for betraying his native Athens, and for an excessive love for all things Spartan or laconophilia. Indeed, Xenophon was a man of his class and his convictions. Xenophon was a conservative and an aristocrat who saw the ideal in the hierarchical structure of Sparta. But behind these political preferences lies something more. In his works, Xenophon appears above all as a humanist, despite his conservative views. His humanism was manifested in a deep, genuine interest in man, his motives, and his behavior. He describes with equal curiosity the valor of his comrades, the customs of wild tribes, the wisdom of Socrates, and the cunning of a Persian. All his life, he sought arete, excellence and virtue, both on the battlefield and in peaceful life. Xenophon remains in history as a symbol of the indomitable human spirit. His life showed that even in the most desperate situation, one can maintain dignity, discipline, and the will to live. His story is an eternal reminder that leadership is above all responsibility, and courage is the ability to act in spite of fear. Xenophon's sword has long turned to dust, but his pen proved more durable than steel, carrying the glory of his 10,000 comrades through the centuries and making them immortal. And as long as there are stories of the strength of the spirit and the search for a way home, he will not be forgotten. For such stories to continue to be told, subscribe to our channel, give us a like, and share your thoughts in the comments.